The major issue with the faithless electors is whether or not they can be forced to vote, how they pledge, and whether or not they can be sanctioned for not voting who they pledge to vote for. So, yeah, we can do that.
Let me ask you a question right quick. You talked about a while ago the Supreme Court decision, tied them in. Early on, the first couple of elections, there was no rules like that, right? They weren't bound. Is that correct? Or for the popular vote?
Well, if you look at the first two elections, there was still the Electoral College that had to vote. But in effect, Washington was unopposed in both of his elections. So the very first election where there was opposition was the 1796 election between Adams and Jefferson, where some faithless electors did not vote for Pinckney for vice president, and therefore Jefferson became the vice president. So whatever would have happened if there was an issue in the very first two elections, since Washington ran unopposed with Adams as his vice president, there was no issue.
Okay.
Now, an interesting issue arose during the 1820 election. Now, the 1820 election was James Monroe running for a second term. Now, James Monroe ran unopposed. So when the Electoral College met, and this was, again, this was before the 12th, or was it before the 12th Amendment? I believe this was the election before the 12th Amendment, but I may be wrong. But what happened was a Southern elector, I'm sorry, not a Southern elector, he was a Northern elector named William Plummer, he became a faithless elector. He cast one electoral vote for John Quincy Adams. And supposedly, the reason he did this was he was of the belief that no presidential candidate other than George Washington should win by acclamation or win 100% of the ballot. So again, it was a meaningless vote, but it was a faithless vote all the same. And James Monroe did not win 100% of the Electoral College.
Interesting.
So, I mean, if we're going to talk about faithless electors, there were 165 faithless electors. Now, in 1872, Ulysses Grant, running for his second term, faced Horace Greeley. And it was a landslide. Horace Greeley received 63 electoral votes, or should have received 63 electoral votes. Horace Greeley died before the Electoral College met. So, of his 63 electoral votes, 3 were cast for Greeley, and they were rejected because Greeley died, and 60 were cast for other candidates, none of whom were going to win, but some of them were accepted by the Electoral College. So Grant did not win 100% of the vote, but this was one reason why probably faithless electors are not faithless electors. Now, Chris, you and I did the election results of the 1912 election.
Right.
And that was Wilson against Theodore Roosevelt and Taft, where Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson was elected president by the Electoral College. Now, Taft received 6 electoral votes, and his running mate, Sherman, also would have received 6 electoral votes. Sherman died right before the election, and prior to anyone else could be put on the Republican ticket. So it was agreed that a fellow named Butler would get Sherman's electoral votes for vice president. So the 6 electors who, and of course they voted for Taft for president, and he lost to Wilson and Roosevelt, but the 6 electors cast their votes for Butler, who received those votes. Those votes were accepted, and obviously Wilson's vice presidential candidate became the vice president. And let me, as an aside, let me jump back to the election of 1824, where we discussed Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay. And the reason I want to jump back is because there were no issue in the vice presidential electoral race on that election. There were some faithless electors who did not vote for the proper vice presidential candidate, but John C. Calhoun, a Southern senator, became the vice president through the Electoral College and actually served as Adams's vice president.
Huh. Okay.
So even though there were no faithless voter issues, even though there were faithless voters in 1824, Adams won via the House of Representatives, but Calhoun became vice president through the Electoral College. Now, so basically, taking out those 71 electors during the Greeley campaign in 1872 and the Sherman vice presidential campaign in 1912, there were 94 faithless voters. In 2000, one of the electors from Washington, D.C., abstained, did not cast her electoral vote. And she did not cast her electoral vote, not because she was against the presidential candidate, and assuming that the 2000 election obviously was Bush and Gore, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes, you're right.
She specifically said if Gore would have been able to win the election, she would have cast the vote for Gore. But she abstained because she wanted to show that or she claimed that Washington, D.C. was a colony, and it didn't matter one way or another, but she wanted to make a protest. Now, we've talked about some of the electoral votes, the faithless voters. We talked about the 23 Virginia voters from 1937. I'm sorry, from 1836, 1837, who refused to cast their votes for Vice President Richard Johnson. We've talked about William Plummer. There was in 1972 an elector named McBride who cast his votes for the Libertarian Party. So the Phosphorus got one electoral vote for president, and Tony Nathan got one electoral vote for vice president. Now, the reason this is interesting is Tony Nathan was the first woman, and if I'm not mistaken, the first Jew to receive an electoral vote.
Wow.
And then in 2020, a number of electoral electors in Washington refused to vote for Hillary Clinton. However, the voters replaced these 10 electoral voters with voters who did vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, in Colorado, again, 4 voters did not want to vote for Hillary Clinton, but they, if I'm not mistaken, they were fined $1,000 each because they were faithless electors. Now, the 2 cases, now that these might be vice versa, but I think I have these right. But the 2 cases we mentioned before, Chiafalo versus Washington and Colorado Department of State versus Blair, were Supreme Court states, and they both said the states may enforce their laws to punish faithless electors. And
I wasn't aware of that.
Pardon?
I wasn't aware of that. So you tell me, you mentioned it earlier.
Right. And and obviously we mentioned the 2 other Supreme Court cases, Ray versus Blair, which again, in effect, annulled the 1 man, 1 vote rule for electors who've made the pledge to vote for the party that they've pledged to, and the McPherson state, which allows the states, based on the Constitution, to allow the states not to present a winner-take-all ballot, as Maine and Nebraska did in the last election and in the last few elections. So basically, that takes care of the history and the most interesting faithless electors matters.